Welcome. Delighted to bring everyone to this amazing, extraordinary event that we have on today to celebrate the most outstanding work from an Indigenous reporter working in Canada this year by an Indigenous Youth Reporter. It's a real honor to be here and to be hosting this on behalf of JHR, but celebrating in particular the incredible work that the journalists we'll be hearing from today have put forward. And it is my honor to introduce the panel. We have an incredibly distinguished panel, but this is also our first opportunity to introduce what is now JHR's Indigenous Advisory Committee to the world, which is very exciting for us. So I will be doing that without further ado. So on the panel, we have with us today the four of the most preeminent Indigenous journalists working in Canada right now. We have Angela Sterritt, award-winning journalist, including 2 awards this week, author, artist, keynote speaker, and marathon runner. She has worked as a journalist for close to 20 years, and she's been with the CBC since 2003 and is a proud member of the Gitxsan Nation. Karyn Pugliese, an Algonquin Italian professor of journalism at Ryerson University, who is best known for her work as a Parliament Hill reporter and as executive director of news and current affairs at APTN. She also serves as an ambassador with JHR. She works with the Canadian Association of Journalists and as a CJFE, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression board member. Ryan McMahon, an Anishinaabe creative who jokes, talks, yells, and writes for a living. Ryan's podcast and media work, including the Thunder Bay and Return to Thunder Bay work, has audiences of millions and has made him one of the most sought after Indigenous creatives on the planet, I'm told. At least this is what's in the bio, but we'll hear more about that shortly. And Tanya Talaga, a multiple award-winning Ojibwe writer and speaker whose mother's family is from Fort William First Nation. She worked as a journalist at the Toronto Star for more than 20 years. She's the author of 7 Fallen Feathers and All Our Relations, Finding a Path Forward. And she's the president and CEO of Makwa Creative. We'll be hearing first from the panelists to discuss the topic of the future of Indigenous journalism. And it's really wonderful in this time of pandemic to actually be able to genuinely celebrate something worth celebrating with this event. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what the panelists have to say on that topic. And then we'll be keeping everyone in suspense to eventually hear from the award nominees. We have Chesney Martin. She is Haudenosaunee from the Turtle Clan of the Seneca Nation, living on the 6 nations of the Grand River Territory Reserve, a freelance journalist and cultural interpreter at the Woodland Cultural Center. She was nominated for How Can You Reconcile on Stolen Land, and she'll be speaking later in the program about that work. Oscar Baker III. He is Black and Mi'kmaq from Elsipogtog First Nation, and he is currently working as a freelance journalist and homemaker from his home in Indian Island First Nation. He was nominated for A Story of Resilience. The decision to take the son off life support still haunts Membertou First Nation father. And last but by no means least, Shelby Lisk. She is a Kayan Kehaka photographer, filmmaker, and journalist with roots in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, and she is currently TVO's Indigenous Hub staff writer. She was nominated for For Our Children, How Families Are Passing Down Indigenous Languages. We'll find out who won towards the end of the program, but right now, with no further ado, I am going to pass it on to Ryan McMahon, who will be your moderator for today's panel discussion on the future of Indigenous journalism. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everybody, and congrats to our shortlist and to all of the long listers as well. I think the problem with lists is they are inherently un-Indigenous, right? That we're, and the fact that we just have a panel of four of us is inherently un-Indigenous. There are so many others that can and should be in this room that have valuable experiences and insights into the question in front of us today, which is the future of Indigenous journalism. That, you know, we often find ourselves in these places where it's like, come and be the voice. And we're like, but what about them and them and them and the aunties, the uncles, you know, everybody that helps set the table. And so I would be remiss not to mention all of those other journalists that are not here today, that have set the table for us to be here. And it's an important reminder to look back, to look forward. Biskabayong, right, in the Anishinaabe language. Remember what is behind us to help us move toward the future. And so in saying that, congrats to our shortlisters that have joined us here. What an exciting group of works that we got to choose from as a jury. And I can tell you that I've been on a bunch of juries now. Like I've got gray hair. I'm chubbier than I used to be. Apparently, have some experience and insight into the value of these works. And I have to say, this was not an easy process. That we sat for a good amount of time to come in and blow up each other's thoughts and ideas on what might be listed in the shortlist, and to all of the incredible works that we considered. Congratulations to everyone. These lists are difficult, and being on a jury is no easy task. So congratulations to everyone. To set the table today, I do want to turn the floor over to our panelists to allow them to give us a brief preamble of where they are in their work today. I think we all know who these journalists are, but give us a sense of who you are, where you're coming from, and tell us something about a work that you're currently involved in that excites you. And then we'll go into our discussion topics. I'll start with my Brady Bunch layout that I have in front of me. I have Karyn, Tanya, and finally Angela. Karyn, over to you.
Okay, now I have to, what am I supposed to say again?
Tell us who you are, where you're coming from, and something you're currently working on or toward that is exciting for you, something that looking to the future of your own work that you're really amped about.
Yeah, okay, so my name is Karyn Pugliese. I was a working journalist for many years. I still have a column here and there in the National Observer, and occasionally appear on CBC. But I think right now I'm working as an assistant professor at Ryerson University, and we're reconsidering the course curriculum. One of the things that I think, if you've read any of my writing or heard me preach sometimes, I often refer back to the fact that when I was in going through school myself, I went and took Canadian history. And if I wanted to know anything about Indigenous people, I had to take Indigenous history, as if Indigenous people didn't live in Canada. So the separation of things has come to bother me, and we're working at Ryerson University of actually putting content about Indigenous people into all the main journalism courses. It's something we're experimenting with, and I've been asked to work on over the next year. So I'm very excited about that.
Excellent. Thank you, Karyn. Tanya.
Zo, Tanya Talaga Nagisnikas, Kamusko Pimushishet Pineshish Nagisnikas. I'm coming to you today from Toronto, and thank you so much for having me. This is like pretty cool, you know. Who would have thought or imagined, you know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that we'd be sitting here with these talented young journalists. And it gives me like so much hope to see you guys and to, you know, even be on a panel of my peers. It's so great, you know. I'm just I'm thrilled, and I want everyone to know that they're doing such amazing work, and I'm just so grateful to be among you. So I am here in Toronto. Yeah, it's been a tough pandemic. We're all still here. I can't wait to go back up north. Feels like, you know, we're trapped in our houses right now. And this is a way that we sort of get together, you know, is electronically. And I really appreciate that actually right now, you know, even something like this is a really good good thing for all of us, because it gives us hope and it makes us happy. And what is hope and happiness to me? What I'm working on? I am working on this really cool. Okay, we haven't told anyone about it really, but I'm going to tell you about it now. Is this really cool podcast called Anti-Up, and it's all about Indigenous women for Indigenous women. It's for our aunties and our sisters, and it's so super cool. And I'm working on this with Kim Wheeler and Jolene Banning. And we have a whole host of rotating hosts of women, First Nation, Métis, Inuit, that are going to be in the chair talking about stuff that we care about. We're going to be talking about beating. We're going to be talking about whose Bannock's better. We're going to be talking about, serious things too. Land back. We're going to be talking about treaties. We're going to be talking about what's going on with our women. And this has been something that that's come into development out of something that didn't go that great. So we're really happy to have this going on, and it's going to be launching in about a month. So please watch for it. And it's called Anti-Up.
Awesome. Thank you, Tanya. Very exciting. Angela, congratulations, first and foremost to you on your newest award. I think you might have a shelf built in your house at some point. Really happy for you. And, the backstory that you shared with everyone in terms of your journey is just so incredible. And so I think all of us here are happy for you and your work in the trenches. Very inspiring. So congrats to you. We turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Ryan, Amia, and to share the stage with all of you too is so amazing. And Tanya and Karyn have both been such incredible inspirations, but also just support and love. And I feel like our industry needs more of that. I just spoke to a number of women from Indigenous, and I just said my focus right now is on healing, reciprocity, and decolonization. And the healing part, I just feel needs to be front and center. But so my name's Angela Sterritt. I'm Gitxsan. I'm registered with the Gitnamax band. But my blood comes from Kispiox because of the Indian Act and all of that stuff and disenfranchisement. I'm now with the Gitnamax band. I work at CBC. Been with CBC since 2003, started as a radio journalist in the 90s and just loved it. Took to it right away. Loved sticking a mic in front of people's face and hearing their stories. And I mean, I don't know if I want to tell you the stories I'm working on right now. They're pretty depressing. One's on like a prison and COVID, and one's on language and people not being able to register their businesses. And the other one is on racism. But I would say my focus right now is just on making our newsroom safe. And it doesn't mean cultural safety. It means getting racism out. And it means people like me who have power and privilege going on Twitter and being mouthy in the newsroom, and just not allowing racism to exist anymore. That's our biggest barrier and has been a really violent space for many Indigenous people. And that's why when I look around in our newsrooms and there's not any, that's why, because it's not safe. And so that's my focus right now is on healing, and that's a big project, but it's also like a welcoming space for me to be in mentally. So yeah, thank you for having me. Amia.
Thanks, Angela. always doing the light work off of the side of your desk. And thank you to all of the panelists for making time to be here. As Rachel said, we are volunteers with JHR on the board, and having the chance to be here this afternoon to assist in the conversation is really our joy and our privilege. So thanks again to JHR for having us. We wanted to have this discussion today to look ahead to the future of Indigenous journalism in celebration of the next generation that's coming. And I think in order to do so, we do want to spend just a couple minutes looking back to see where we came from, to identify where we might be going. So I'll go to you, Karyn, to tell us a little bit about how you see the coverage of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous issues writ large shifting over the span of your career relative to where we are and where we've been.
Yeah, I think it's better. I mean, it is better. I think we went from no coverage, or, there was always a stereotypical coverage. And I remember there was a brief time where I left journalism and I was working in an Assembly of First Nations on communications. And I can remember the national chief at the time was Phil Fontaine, and he said, I think people think that the government gives us all this money and it just disappears into a black hole someplace. And the real issues about underfunding of education, the child welfare system, drinking water on reserve, were all sort of shifted off and blamed on First Nations people. It was a very popular media line for government back in the day to say, if you said we don't have schools, we don't have water, they'd say, we already give X million dollars. And so it was some communications work, not by myself, but by BFN, to go out and actually do the comparison of how much money other Canadians get for education, for water, for housing, et cetera, and how much First Nations get, and to come up with that evidence base. But it was really strange to me that as a basic human rights issue, not having water, not having access to education would be a blame the victim, approach from the media. I think that's changed. I think people have learned their way out of that. But there's still a lot of, now that I'm a professor, I read all sorts of things, including qualitative and quantitative analysis of media, where people go through piles of media and take a look at stereotypes in there. And there's still somewhat a portrayal of Indigenous people as a problem to be solved. The way the stories are constructed, we're rarely experts in our own stories. Usually somebody outside the community who's non-native and sometimes in opposition to the things we want or need is the expert voice. We hear a lot of the government says and Indigenous people claim. So the wording, the structure of the story still has an implicit bias in it. And I think one of the good things that really happened last year and this year is we're starting to talk about implicit bias. That was a lot. I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Thank you, Karyn. Tanya, I wanted to kind of build on that because you found yourself in the largest papers in Canada. And you've been a loud advocate for change. And inside of these large machines, it seems as though it can be lonely. And I won't speak for you. I've never been there. But I want to ask, has the increase in the number of Indigenous reporters and people inside of the large machinery of Canadian media, has it created a better environment for you to operate as a journalist that has found themselves in these large machines inside of Canadian media?
You know what? Thanks for asking that question. It was just kind of funny because I started off by saying how thankful I was, right, at the beginning that we're all here, because you're absolutely right. It was kind of lonely in the early. Oh, see, when did I start? 1995. I started at the Toronto Star, and you definitely feel like, and I was the only Indian in the room, right? It was like that for a long time. The people that were covering our issues were always non-Indigenous, and Indigenous affairs would come and go. It would depend on the flavor of the editor, I guess, at the paper. And oftentimes our issues, this is one thing that it always interests me, and to this day is covered by parliamentary bureaus. And I always thought, wow, isn't that interesting? It's because like we're seen as a foe, right? Politics. That's what it's all about. It's like we don't have anything else going on. Like we don't. But what about who we are as people? What about the food we eat? What we sing and what we dance and what we do? But no, it was politics, right? And it was always out of the bureaus. It was weird at the beginning, and it's just gotten so much better, but it also hasn't, to be quite frank with you. yeah, until we're in the positions of power, until we are the managing editors, the executive editors, until we are the managing editors of the TV news, until we are the directors, the owners, we will not get to where we need to go. I actually left mainstream media. I left the Star, oh my gosh, after taking a couple book leaves and after the Atkinson Fellowship. And I'm currently freelance at the Globe and Mail. And so I am continuing sort of working on my own, you know, and that's why I started Makwa Creative. We want to lift up Indigenous voices and to do things, you know, primarily for ourselves. And that's sort of where that came from. I could go on about this. I won't, but, you know, has it gotten better and more friendly? Yes and no, right? I mean, there are more of us, yes, but not enough at all. And we still have things like when we saw with the National Inquiry with murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, right? All of the major papers and news outlets just attacked genocide. No, it's not genocide.
Yeah.
And that was just, when was that? 2 years ago? Almost 2 years ago now.
Almost, yep.
So it's not like it was, you know, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This was, and this is, you know, and we all work here, and it's like, okay, well, if you're saying all that, then you must think that all the work we've done is wrong.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't, you know. So we still have a long way to go in media, and I actually think media has a lot to answer for. Decades and decades of media, 153 years of it, actually, for the stories that they've missed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And that type of honesty, I think, is really what is going to best serve the next generation, right? Like, it's exciting because it seems as though, because there is a more of us out there, and there are more opportunities to publish, but A, the price has been paid in full. B, I think, as you say, we're not there yet, and C, there's a lot of work left to do. I'm going to go to Angela. Angela, you were in on the ground floor at CBC Indigenous, and I don't expect you to, you know, pull the curtain back on the inner workings of your work there and the team there. But it's an exciting time to know that these efforts have began in earnest at the CBC, and I'm wondering that what you think in terms of the authentic coverage of Indigenous issues itself. If having Indigenous journalists in a unit like the CBC Indigenous unit has been helpful, if it has moved the chains, if that authentic voice is responsible solely or in part for the change in the coverage that we've seen over the last handful of years.
Yeah, I think it's CBC Indigenous as a unit is really important. I don't actually work with them at all. So I work as a reporter, multi-platform reporter at CBC Vancouver and CBC British Columbia. And yeah, I mean, Connie Walker started that unit in 2013. And I don't know if people remember, but that was just such an exciting time. I remember 2011, CBC's Eighth Fire came out, and it was really powerful in that it was a mainstream documentary series addressing stereotypes that Indigenous people are cast with in the news. And it felt like a real honest mainstream look at Indigenous people. And I just remember being on Twitter, and people, like Indigenous people, were like, oh my God, this is amazing. And it felt like a first. And then shortly after that, we had Idle No More. And I just remember there was like an appetite to hear from so many different voices and Indigenous reporters as well. And I mean, at CBC, things have been really skewed, right? Like there was a time when we weren't allowed to use the word survivor to describe residential school survivors. We had to use the term student, right? And there's been this real colonial normalization, a normalization of colonization that has been pushed and promoted throughout mainstream media. You know, and I always tell people this, like, I'm not standing up there with a microphone saying I'm standing on, you know, unceded Tsleil-Waututh territory. I'm saying Vancouver. And there's a lot of things that we're normalizing, and a lot of that is a white man's perspective in news today. So, you know, I think at the time, CBC Aboriginalism, as it was called then, was super important. I was able to tell really complex stories that no one else had an appetite for at the CBC at the time at all, you know, about the oil sands. And I actually went to the oil sands and told that story, talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, talking to the family members from a very different perspective. And having those different perspectives, those Indigenous perspectives, was so critical. And we were able to, that unit was able to move the arrow like extremely. I think where we're at now is a very different time in that, you know, like a couple of years ago, we weren't really allowed to use the term racism, right? It was just like, oh, I don't think that's like, that's a big word to use, right? And, you know, I've been pushing back and saying climate change is human caused and it's real. There's no debate. Same as racism. It's wrong. There's no debate. And as news organizations, that should be boilerplate, but it hasn't been. There's been a real pushback on Indigenous perspectives of things like racism and things like colonization. I remember, just like the word survivor, colonization, using that word was a no-no. Like that's a big word to use, you know, for everybody. And or the 60s scoop, like, oh, we have to explain what that is. No one knows what that is. And for years, residential school survivors weren't even believed, you know. So this, you know, when I started in the 90s, that was my starting place. And I always just wanted to tell Indigenous stories. I wasn't able to for a long time. And, you know, I remember telling just the most ridiculous stories for the news that I had no passion about. And just me being able to tell Indigenous stories as an Indigenous person was totally like revolutionary. Like, you're going to be biased going into this. And, you know, I was telling the last group that I spoke to, and like you said about the CSA, like it's just been a lot of racism. And I still am the only First Nations woman who is open about it, very open and mouthy, in the CBC in British Columbia. And we've seen people leave, right? So we've seen a lot of Indigenous journalists leave. So there's a lot coming. There's Indigenews, which is incredible. And I love all these like new outlets that are popping up that are just focused on Indigenous journalists, but there's a lot of Indigenous people leaving the mainstream too. So we've come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to do, as Karyn and Tanya were both saying. Yeah. Right.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and I want to be clear. I didn't mean to infer that you're with CBC Indigenous now. I clumsily was asking the question. You'll find out very quickly. I'm not very good at this job. But yeah, meant to just more ask you about the importance of CBC Indigenous to the sort of the change that we see in front of us. Because I think yeah, there's like the skeptic in me thinks, and if this is offside, that's kind of on brand for me. The skeptic in me thinks that CBC saw the traction that CBC Aboriginal got through its coverage of Idle More and other things and went, wow, they pull real numbers here. And why is that? Well, it turns out that Canada really cares about these stories. It turns out there is an audience for these stories. And I just remember that unit coming through and really pushing these stories to the top. And I think to this day in 2021, we really see the thirst and the need for these stories in the numbers and the shares and the analytics that we get to see through its through social media and whatnot. We have told only about 12 minutes or so left, so I do want to kind of focus on where Indigenous journalism is going from here, but start by asking what role you all see in Indigenous owned media playing in the future of our journalism, in looking at the startup culture and the types of movement that we see Indigenous people turning to the internet for, looking at crowd-funded journalism, things like Indigenews, which is building our own proprietary Indigenous platforms. How important is that going to be in the future of Indigenous journalism? And is this the answer in whole or in part to where we might be going, and what excites us about the opportunity we have? Anyone can start here.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just jump in because I mean, of course, I spent years working in Indigenous news at APTN. And they launched their APTN in 1999, but 2000 was when they launched the newsroom. And it was like this entry of all these voices. Like there weren't that many Indigenous journalists at all back then. And then all of a sudden forced into your home, as we were constantly reminded, shoved down the throats of Canadians, came this mandatory station of Indigenous journalists. But we were really focused on having a conversation amongst ourselves. I think there's room for mainstream media to have a conversation with Canadians, or take our issues or explain who we are to Canadians. But there's also the conversation amongst ourselves that needs to happen. And APTN is great. But I mean, I actually played a small role in starting to launch Indigenews, because we do know that legacy media is struggling, and we need to have outlets and we need to have more voices. I mean, it's great to have an APTN, a national newscast, but there's regional, local communities. So the work that, like that you did, Ryan, for example, in Thunder Bay, the work that Tanya did, looking into student deaths from not just Thunder Bay, but all the communities around it. These are stories that really need to be told. To Tanya's earlier point, what do people know about us? I mean, I think if you ask the average Canadian, imagine a day in the life of the Prime Minister. They could probably sketch something out. What's the average day in the life of a national chief? What's the average day of a school teacher in Vancouver? They could probably imagine, I'll wake up, have coffee. What's the average day of a student at Mi'kmaq? What do they do first thing in the morning? Go out and get a bucket of water, bring it up to the house, so these are the, seeing us as whole people, I think, is something that still needs to happen. And I think there's a need for many voices.
I think you're right with that, Karyn. And I'm glad you mentioned APTN and the history of APTN, because APTN has really been a guiding light too, right? It's and it needs to be that. It needs to be that for all of us. And I just wanted to say that I think that owning our own platforms and going forward is probably a really good thing to do. I think that we have a power as Indigenous people to tell stories. That's our power. That's what's sustained many of us for so long, right? We weren't writing it down. We were telling our children, we were telling our elders were telling us stories. And I think that our stories can be change makers. And I think that all of us as journalists too, I mean, we're not just journalists, right? I mean, this is like, we live this too, right? And so it's a little bit different for us, I think, as journalists. And I think if we can use our stories to affect positive change for our people, I think that's a great, great thing. And saying that too, we can't leave legacy media behind. Like I struggled with that for a bit, and I'm very grateful to have a voice at the Globe every 2 weeks, and I think that's important. I think it's important that we sort of be in the faces of people that wouldn't normally read us, and that's and Angela does that too on CBC, right, with the stories that she does, and that's hard as well, because then you get the blowback, then you get like the horrible comments and the Twitter attacks, and that's not fun. So what does that all say? Still got a long way to go, but I think that we're best when we do things ourselves.
Thank you, Tanya. I've been the bosses behind the scenes have gently told me I have 5 minutes. I'm notoriously over time all the time, and so I'll ask for an extra minute. So we have 6 minutes remaining, just to break the rules a little bit. And you know, I think we could sit here all day. I think proprietary ownership over media is the next thing. When I started Indian and Cowboy in 2014, I mean, this was the whole impetus for it, right? Is that I had a bunch of stuff in development in the mainstream and it moved too slow. And then it was just like, what are we waiting for? Like the opportunity is there. But to Tanya's point, continuing to work in the mainstream, I think, is so valuable. They have libel insurance often. I don't. So like when I really want to piss people off, I knock on the doors of the big white men that can cover my ass with the insurance. So for all those emerging ones that are watching, get good insurance or work for someone that has it. Angela, I want to spin to you, and we'll end on this question: where we see Indigenous journalism going from here. I think you've directed us into an important and challenging conversation that may be a panel all in, of its own, is how you are supported in the newsroom and what those missing pieces are. So I feel like that might be part of the answer, but in the form of a question to you, where do you see Indigenous journalism going from here, from this moment we're in today?
Yeah, what you said about liable or having lawyers, that's critical, man. Like, yeah, it's wild out there right now. Definitely been important for me to have that. And yeah, I mean, it's been equally important for me to have bosses that, you know, when I got the award yesterday, I was just sending a bunch of voice memos to my bosses, just saying like, you know, thanks for, you know, cheering me on when I'm in the ring, fighting for our space, for our voice, for our stories, for our perspectives. But thanks for jumping in the ring with me too. And that felt really emotional just because I've never had that in my life. You know, I've always just had people saying, you know, this story is not good enough. You know, no matter how investigative it was, no matter how many incredible characters I had, no matter how many weeks I spent on it, it was like, we're going to pull this last minute from the newscast because we don't get it. It doesn't make sense to us. And they're just being like starting at zero. You know, this was 4 years ago. I had this attitude around me. And, you know, you can't tell that story as an Indigenous person. You know, meanwhile, there's, you know, a bunch of white people covering city hall or provincial politics, all white stuff, all white guy stuff, or getting props for having white cop sources or whatever, and just being treated completely differently. And so, you know, having my white bosses, you know, jump in the ring with me and just being like, it's okay, we got you, we're going to take this on for you. And, you know, we hear a lot about recruitment and retention in the industry of Indigenous people or Black people. We see very little Black people in mainstream media. And, you know, like, how do we recruit? How do we recruit? Where are you? And it's like, well, we're right here. But this isn't a safe space. And one of the ways to make it safe is to not tolerate racist behaviors. You know, when people are asking ridiculous questions that they know are racist, or, you know, calling people tokens, or just saying racial slurs, you know, all the time. It's not appropriate. And one of the things I think is beautiful right now is that, you know, I had somebody last year say to me, like, you're just getting this nomination because you're Indigenous. Your body of work just clearly doesn't stand up to all the white men in this newsroom. Name them all. And my message right today is, you know what? Our stories matter today, and they've always mattered. They're just as important. Only today there is a shift, right? There is a shift of people saying, wow, there's a variety of stories on the table that are being told in, you know, incredible, you know, difficult, complex stories being told. And these awards being given out shows that there's a shift in what we consider important in our society. And it's not just all white guy perspectives right now. And that to me is hopeful that other perspectives, you know, when you're walking down the street, who are you seeing? Is it all white men? No. Those perspectives are being brought to the forefront, and we're being told that they matter, that we care about them, and that they're deserving of coverage and awards. And so that's where I see the hope. And yeah, like Indigenous, I just talked to them before I jumped on here, and they're, you know, very new journalists, but working in a very safe space with each other. And that's power. That's amazing. And not having to fight every day, you know, but we need to make more space, and that means not tolerating racism. But there is hope.
Yeah. You know, Indigenous stories often complex, nuance, powerful. Like, these are the words that we often use. The future of Indigenous journalism, pretty straightforward. Anti-racist newsrooms. Like, it's not enough to be like, oh, I'm not racist. Well, are you anti-racist? And I think that's again probably another panel, but something for all of us to think about. Karyn, the future of Indigenous journalism as it intersects with J School. I'm going to throw that one to you because you're inside of an educational institution. Where do you see things? And I apologize. I know we are winding down. It feels rude to say, but if we could have 2 minutes or less as a challenge, that would be good. I have one more for Tanya, and then we'll turn it back over to Rachel for our award winners.
I can absolutely be brief. I just want to acknowledge that, you know, seeing Angela in mainstream media is so important. You know, when you're talking about the future of journalism, I remember in the early days of APTN, one of our reporters went up to a community and said he was a journalist, and the kids said, "But Indigenous people can't be journalists, can they?" So to see a strong and powerful woman at the CBC like Angela is absolutely so important to role model. In universities, there's a lot of discussion now about implicit bias, and really recognizing, you know, that when you go to tell the story, you're bringing a point of view with you. And I think a lot of the fighting for the stories, you know, when young journalists go in, I know when I was working in mainstream media, and probably all of us, trying to convince somebody that a story is important, it's breaking through that wall because your non-Indigenous manager may not recognize how important the story is because it's not important to their community, to their family. And so you really have to say, but it's important to our community, our family, and you must have it on and included in your news. So we're having a lot of conversations like that in university, and the journalists who are graduating now are you know, like diverse, and I think very eager to push for diversity in the industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Karyn. Tanya, you are someone that is working independently, and as you've indicated, still have good favor inside at the Globe and Mail. Is this the future, this sort of hybrid model? Or are you seeing this for yourself, at least, as part of the answer? What do you see in terms of the space that you're currently occupying and actively building with your comrades inside of Makwa Creative?
Miigwech, you know what? Yeah, I think it is. Maybe it is, right? Because as Angela said too, like, she wasn't in the ring alone, right? She had those bosses that were with her, the people that believed in her and in what she was doing, and like, we got to figure out a way to all live together and work together, right? So that's just the reality. So I think so. Yeah, I think we have to figure this out, and it's not an easy path, but I think we can work on all these different platforms. Like, look at all of us. Look at you. You do that too, right? You work, like, sometimes you write for the papers. You've got your podcast. You've got film. You've got everything, right? I think that that's a way forward for us, is to be working on those levels, because it all comes back to, at the end of the day, story, right? And storytelling. And I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, when you tease apart the word Daba Jimwenan in the Ojibwe language, talks about it starts the definition of that word starts with the heart, right? And the heart that the three of you show in the work that you do, the work that you've done, the work that you aim to do is very self-evident. And Tanya pointing towards story being sort of the corner post for all of us is instructive, right? And to all of the emerging ones that are coming behind us, walking beside us, in some cases running far ahead of us, right? Better ideas, more energy. I'm tired, man. We're also tired all the time. So all of the emerging ones, and I hate this language, but it's what it is, it's what we call it, that are running so far ahead of us with better ideas, more energy, more instructed cultural knowledge, a better grounding in a sense of who they are and where they come from. I mean, is so invigorating. 20 years ago when I finished university and started working as an actor and as a writer, and the space is unrecognizable. You know, it's the young people today. Here's where my grumpy uncle sort of sets foot on the stage, is like, the young people today are so much smarter, so much lighter in spirit than my generation, right? They're one generation, sometimes one generation removed from the legacy of the trauma and everything else. And so, you know, I feel like we're in good hands, and the heart and the good heart and good minds that the three of you as panelists have brought here today is really valuable and important. So, you know, gichimi gwech to the three of you for doing this work for us here today. My boss, very kindly, Lee, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of extra space to land this plane, to turn the floor over to Karyn to introduce our nominees and their works, so that we can now raise our hands to them and celebrate them, is where we are inside of our schedule. So Karyn, I'll turn it over to you, and let's get on with the show with our shortlist.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thanks for moderating. So great. Now here's the moment that everybody's really been waiting for, and it is the nominees. We talked about them at the beginning, but I want to remind everybody who they are. So we have Chesney Martin, who is Haudenosaunee from the Turtle Clan of the Seneca First Nations, living on the Six Nations of the Grand River. She is a freelance journalist and a cultural interpreter at the Woodland Cultural Center. And she's nominated for How You Can Reconcile on Stolen Land, which covers the land action that was held at 1492 Landback Lane in Caledonia last year by the Haudenosaunee land defenders. Now, we really love this piece for its deep probing of the issues, which included contextualizing the meaning of the land, the Haudenosaunee people, historic treaties, and the law. So, Chesney, I'm just gonna please tell us, take a minute or two to tell us a little bit about yourself and about your story.
Okay, thank you. So, sego sewa kwego chego nigo haskoni yon gyatsta no devasa gaili na tuwa gosiliago wagenyato dan sudino tuwani haga nigo gumanjodo. So my name is Chesney Martin, and I've already been introduced, but I'm 24 years old, and I am a descendant of Hall of Fame lacrosse players on my father's side and hereditary chief lineage on my mother's side. I am extremely honored to have been shortlisted. I was commissioned to write my story on behalf of The Pigeon, which is an incredible, inclusive national youth publication. Their project called Tracing Threads opened for my angle, which is reflected in the title, How Can You Reconcile on Stolen Land? As many already know, Landback Lane is situated on disputed Six Nations land. In the story I wrote, I included words from the spokesperson, lawyers, a poet, and even a Haudenosaunee journalist that had charges pressed against him. And I maintain that it was their voices that needed a platform. I also know how privileged I am to have grown up on the stories of my people, our Confederacy system, the War of 1772, the Covenant Chain, the plight of Diskahe, and stories of systemic land dispossession. So I wove segments of this history into the story to help paint the picture as to why Landback Lane exists, because this dispute really showed just how apparent that dialogue is needed for the surrounding communities. I would really like to just extend so much gratitude for this experience as well. I hope everyone behind this is given the appreciation that they deserve to know just how much this experience means as a young Indigenous journalist. To feel seen and be amongst so many elite individuals is a dream. And a lot of the dialogue from the panel resonated. And all I have to say is, thank you so much.
Beautiful words, Chesney. You can see why you're such a great writer. Next, I want to introduce Oscar Baker III, who is Black and Mi'kmaq from Elsipogtog First Nation, and also a brand new father. He is currently working as a freelance journalist and homemaker from his home in the Indian Island First Nation. And he's nominated for A Story of Resilience. Decision to take son off life support still haunts Membertou First Nation's father. Now, this is a story of a father's journey to reconcile with his decision to remove his 7-year-old son from life support in 1997 after his son was critically injured in an accident. And it is empathetic and sensitively told. What we liked was the grounding of this story in identity and personal life history that became a real example of how cultural and spiritual teachings give us all the strength to endure. Oscar, what would you like us to know about yourself and the story?
What Nina Delo is the Oscar Baker III. I'm Black and Mi'kmaq from Elsipogtog First Nation in St. Augustine, Florida. I've been storytelling for almost 7 years now. Grateful to be shortlisted for this story. And I think part of the beauty of being able to tell Danny Paul is how our culture as Mi'kmaq or Inuit meant to telling that story. A bit of behind the scenes was that the Saltwire editorial team wanted stories of resiliency. I was new to Unama'ki, which is the name of the 5 communities of Cape Breton. So I reached out to a friend and they told me that I should talk to a young elder, Danny Paul from Membertou First Nation. But while we were sitting and talking in the Tim Hortons parking lot, I gifted him a tobacco tie. And I think that really meant a lot to him to know that he could trust me with telling his story. And it's a reminder that when we discuss things like the 60 scoop, Indian day school abuses, even the tragedy of Mizo Paul's death, that we need to be trauma informed when we're listening to people and when we're writing those stories. And when even trying to transcribe the tape, I couldn't help but cry, knowing the stakes that it took to try and make that decision. He knew medically that the time was up, but it still took some strength from him and his family to make that decision. And after falling into some bad habits, he became grounded in our Ilnu ways and has since meant so much to all 5 of the communities in Unama'ki to help ground Indigenous youth and elders and other people who have been disconnected from our culture to ground them again into our Mi'kmaq culture and ways. I believe that's all I have to say, Walalio, and best of luck to the other candidates. It means a lot to share the stage with you guys. Nomoltes.
Thank you so much. Not only is the story you told in your article important, but that story that you told about building trust and having empathy and showing kindness and being human as a reporter is a very important reminder to all of us in our work. Thank you for that. Next, Shelby Lisk is a Ganyagahaga photographer, filmmaker, and journalist with roots in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. She is currently TVO's Indigenous Hub staff writer. She's nominated for the piece, For Our Children, How Families Are Passing Down Indigenous Languages. This piece was about the revitalization of language, and it demonstrates the importance of language to the unique worldview of Indigenous people. It explains the deep emotion of connecting with the language and the commitment that it takes to preserve, teach, and learn a vital piece of our culture. We also loved seeing the language used in the piece. Shelby, your turn. Please tell us more about your story and your piece.
Wakanuaradon seo gwego, Shelby ni yungyats, lisk de waxanazre, ganungehaga ni wakunjoron, danon waganyaton, gundege ni toneno ne aguatsere. My name is Shelby Lisk. I'm Mohawk Turtle Clan. My family is from Tanya Talaga, as Karyn mentioned. And the story that I was nominated for, it follows the journey of 3 families and how they're passing their language down to the next generation. And this piece was also written in celebration of the 1-year anniversary of the Indigenous Language Translation Project at TVO, which allows me to have stories that I've written translated into the languages of the communities that I'm working with. So I'm very proud to say that there are 7 translators involved in this piece, and there are 4 different Indigenous languages shared in it, and 2 of those only have less than 30 speakers right now. So, but they have these guardians of the language. So I just want to say thank you to JHR and to the panel for considering my piece for this award.
And thank you for those words, Shelby. The language really is central to how we think and who we are. A very important story. Thank you for your words today. Now, to announce the winner, I'm going to pass off to someone you have seen earlier, but one of the most powerful Indigenous voices in Canada today. My friend, who is also an award-winning writer and inspiring role model for me and everyone else, who's absolutely proven that a journalist with a strong heart and a loving soul can move history forward. Tanya, please take it away.
Miigwech, Karyn, that was beautiful. And thanks for introducing us to all of you. I want you guys to know that you really blew us away with your submissions. We debated for over an hour and a half. This decision was not easy whatsoever. And I just want you to know that every single one of you really should be proud for the work you do. And you are head and shoulders above where I was at your collective ages, I gotta say. And so I am just, I know we're all blown away by what you can do and what you will be doing in the future. And so in the most Anishinaabe way possible, I think you're all winners, and I think that you're all incredible. But we had to come down to one. And when we finally, hashed it out, what is important to us is the use of language. And so we want to say congratulations to Shelby Lisk. Your work really is such a leader. You brought in language, 4 different languages in your piece. Seeing the language in your story really filled us all with so much heart. Ryan talked about earlier about the Anishinaabe way, about how we see things forwards and backwards at the same time, right? In order to go forward, we need to see what is behind us. And we need to remind people of our languages. We need to keep our languages going. And to see it in print digitally was incredible. How you brought the stories forward, incredible. You were storytelling in every single way you could. And so with that, I would like to say congratulations, but congratulations to all 3 of you, because you should all be super proud.
Now go, Tanya. I'm just really honored that JHR and the jury thought that this story was an important one. And I guess to say a little bit more about it, I was drawn to write it because of my own language learning journey, and because I felt that a lot of the stories that I saw about cultural revitalization and language revitalization, they really focused on this uplifting message of, this was taken away from us, but now we have it again. And it almost felt to me like they're saying it's okay that this happened because we're really strong. And when I looked at, where I am as an Indigenous person and a language learner, it just looked a lot messier from where I was sitting. It didn't look like that neat sort of reconciliation package. And I knew that messiness would be harder to report on, but that was what I was really interested in sharing. So I'm very grateful to the families, the Ireland family, the Moscow family, and the Allen family who shared their stories with me, not only for the sake of the piece, but also because it helped me heal as we talked and exchanged notes about our language learning journeys, our setbacks, and shared some of the beautiful elements of our languages with each other. And as I said before, I'm really grateful to all the translators who took the time to bring the piece into the 4 languages, Ojibwe, Lenape, Mohawk, and Oneida Sign Language. So I want to thank each of them because their words are just as important as mine in this piece. So Marcia Ireland and Debbie Parliament, Jason Jones and Shirley Andy, Mina Boves and Karen Moscow and Ian McCallum, Nyawagoa. I also have to acknowledge the beautiful illustration in the piece by Oneida artist Dehajis Tahawi and the work of my editor, Sarah Sweet, on this piece. Thank you to you both. And to my partner, Matthew, who has dedicated the last year to learning Ganyungeha with me and who snuck behind my back to submit this piece for consideration for this award. I also took some time last night to reread the pieces by Oscar and Chesney, and I was really struck by the care that they took with their subjects and the rigorous and dedicated reporting that was evident while tackling extremely complex issues. So I'm honored to have my work nominated next to theirs. And a big thank you to the jury, a group of insanely talented Indigenous journalists who have helped pave the way for our generation. And I know that that was not easy, and I can't thank you enough for the work that you've done. And lastly, thank you to JHR for supporting this award and for all the work that you do for Indigenous journalists. I was reflecting on this and I realized that JHR has been with me through every step of my journalism career, from scholarships in J School to getting me my first internship at APTN here in Ottawa. So again, I can't thank you enough for the work that you do. Nyawagoa.
Wow. Wow, that was so powerful. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, Shelby, for sharing your incredible work. Oscar and Chesney, such powerful stories, such important work. And to Angela, Tanya, Karyn, and Ryan for an incredible conversation about the past, present, and future of Indigenous journalism in this country. This is not easy work, but it is inspiring and joyful work, and you are doing it, and you are leading the way for the current generation and the coming generation. This has been an extraordinary conversation and one that we need to be having on an ongoing basis. For me, it's such an honor to be at this event today, to hear your work and your perspectives and the joy and the love that you bring to what you do. The Indigenous Reporters program was the first program that I launched as executive director of JHR when I took over in 2011, and it's been going in some form since then. We launched in 2012 initially, and it was the year of Idle No More, when Indigenous coverage too often amounted to 3 white guys in a studio in downtown Toronto opining about what they thought Teresa Spence was upset about on her hunger strike. Your work shows that is changing, and we are now starting to see some glimmers of progress, but there's a lot more work to do, as this conversation demonstrates, and a long, long way to go. It's my personal dream that at one point these languages will be taught anywhere people wish to learn them, so that we have a much, much clearer understanding of how we got to this point today. I'll make one more comment before wrapping. Some of you may have noticed that I did not lead with a land acknowledgement for this event. Land, to put it mildly, is tricky. JHR's acknowledgement was developed in consultation, and we do say, ordinarily, for thousands of years that the land that I am currently on in Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Toronto itself is in the Dish with One Spoon Territory, Treaty 13, and is home to Indigenous peoples from many nations across Turtle Island who continue to care for the land today. But I struggle with these acknowledgements because, frankly,
The reality is that claims to this land are deeply contested, and I'd rather the acknowledgement acknowledge that reality and open up an informed conversation about what future ownership, relationships to, and stewardship of this beautiful land could and should be. But bringing it back to stories, these stories matter. The human rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada matter. The work you are all doing is showing that in no uncertain terms. For us at JHR, it is an honor and a privilege to do this work with you, side by side with you. Thank you.